Now that it's been over a month since he lost his life, I think it's okay for me to speak now. I'm going to insinuate that Nolan's life was taken because I do not believe he accidentally drowned. If he drowned, he was forcibly drowned.
At first glance, this looks like a tragic story with a simple outline. An 18-year-old teenager went to Horn Island with friends, something went wrong, and he never came home. But the closer you look at the available record, the less simple the timeline becomes. 3 boats reportedly crossed to the island that morning, yet the publicly discussed chronology is centered primarily on one of them.
So Warren sat down for an interview with White YouTube's Pet Monkey. And he said that they left for Horns Island the morning of July the 4th, and that it was approximately 30 of them spread across 3 boats. They all went to Horn Island together. They arrived at approximately 11:30. So they left around 9-ish, 8, 9-ish, whatever the case may be. They left the morning of July 4th. They arrived on White Devil's Horn Island at about 11:30. So 3 boats, 30 youth, they went together. I'm not clear on whether the 3 boats came back together or not. That's another question that I have, Art. Did they come back together the same way they left together? Because I'm treating all 30 of those white youth and all 3 of those ships as crime scenes and as suspects. All 3 ships are potential crime scenes. All 3 boats are potential crime scenes, and all 30 youth are potential suspects. I don't know why Jackson County Sheriff Ledbetter or Jackson County District Attorney Mulrath, I don't know why they decided to separate the boat that Nolan was on. Warren's boat, I don't know why they separated that boat from the other 2 for purposes of investigation and analysis. Because those 3 boats operated as a team. And since they went out there as a team, and it hasn't been made clear to me whether or not they came back together as a team, all 30 white youth and all 3 boats should have been part of this investigation, not just the 1 boat. That is my first big issue with this case. Who decided to separate the other 2 boats and the other 20 or so youth? I got a problem with that, Art, because according to the Cajun Navy, they have no GPS information on the other 2 boats, Art. They have no GPS information on the other 2 boats. Now let's get into this.
Nolan's phone was back on the mainland while his mother was still being asked late that night whether she had heard from him. A group that arrived before noon reportedly left before 5, while questions remain about the boat trouble that developed around the departure. An independent pathologist was expected to evaluate the death, but important tissue had already been retained by the state. A trained sea tow dispatcher stopped her normal line of questioning long enough to ask whether there was a living person on the boat. Coast Guard assistance was reportedly offered to people on a vessel taking on water offshore.
Explain something to you. Federal hate crimes law, you can go to jail for the rest of your life in case nobody didn't tell you. Federal hate crimes law, you can go to jail for the rest of your life in case nobody told you. Guess what? The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, you can go to jail for up to 30 years. And if Nolan was unalived by more than 1 person, that constitutes a lynching. That constitutes a lynching. So you can go to jail for up to 30 on the Emmett Till Act. You can go to jail for life on the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crimes Act. And in the state of Mississippi, Art, if you are an accessory after the fact, not accomplice. Accomplice means you participated in the murder. Accessory means you helped cover it up afterwards. If you are an accessory to the fact after the fact, Art, you can go to jail for up to 20 years, Mississippi law. So they can go to jail for up to 20 years, Mississippi law. Accessory after the fact, you helped to cover up the crime. You can go to jail for 30 years on the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act because more than one of you probably participated in Nolan's unaliving. And under the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Federal Hate Crimes Act, Art, they can go to jail for life. And this is why I need Nolan's step pop and coach to watch what comes out of their mouth and stop trying to help these white kids avoid accountability for what they did to Nolan.
Yet that assistance was declined. And behind all of those individual questions sits an even larger one. Who is responsible for putting the complete timeline together? That question has to be approached carefully because this case is surrounded by emotion, speculation, and misinformation. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. No agency has publicly stated that a crime occurred, and every person who was present on Horn Island remains entitled to the presumption of innocence. Those facts are not footnotes. They are the boundary around what can responsibly be said. At the same time, the absence of an arrest does not mean every question has been answered. A family can demand a thorough investigation without accusing a specific person of a crime. A journalist can identify gaps in the public record without declaring what caused those gaps. And viewers can ask why certain evidence has not been made available without pretending they already know what that evidence would show. That is the standard here. Documented facts first. Attributed claims second, and answered questions clearly labeled. And unsupported assertions rejected rather than repeated. The first missing piece is the simplest to describe and perhaps one of the most important to reconstruct. 3 boats reportedly crossed to Horn Island. If those 3 vessels were carrying the people involved in the day's events, then a complete investigation should establish the movements of all 3. One boat may have a documented timeline, but that timeline cannot automatically stand in for the other 2. Their departure times, arrival times, movements around the island, return routes, and eventual destinations could either confirm the known chronology or reveal additional gaps. There is no legitimate reason to assume that missing information proves wrongdoing. It may be that the other boats were never equipped with usable tracking systems. It may be that records exist but have not been released. It may be that investigators have the information and simply have not made it public. Each possibility produces a different conclusion, which is precisely why the question needs an answer rather than a theory. A useful investigation begins with chronology because chronology limits speculation. If a vessel left the mainland at a documented time, arrived before noon, remained in the area for several hours, and departed in the afternoon, those timestamps give investigators fixed points. They can be compared with phone records, witness statements, emergency calls, photographs, messages, GPS information, and other evidence. The problem arises when only one vessel has a visible sequence while the other to become blank spaces. At that point, the public cannot independently determine whether everyone stayed together, whether the boats separated, whether people moved between vessels, or whether the return journey happened as previously described. None of those possibilities should be assumed. The point is that a complete timeline should not require the audience to guess what happened outside the documented portion. That becomes even more significant when the afternoon departure is examined. The group reportedly reached Horn Island before noon and left before 5, creating a substantial period in which the events leading to Nolan's disappearance have to be reconstructed. 5 hours is not automatically suspicious. A group can spend an entire afternoon on an island without anything unusual occurring. What matters is what happened during that window and how the different accounts fit together. Was Nolan with the group throughout the visit? When was he last seen? What activities took place? When did anyone first realize something was wrong? When did the decision to leave occur? Were people already preparing to depart when the boat problem developed? Or did the mechanical issue force the decision? Those questions are not interchangeable, because the order of events can change the meaning of everything that followed. The boat trouble is therefore more than a side detail. If the vessel began taking on water, the investigation should be able to establish when that happened, what caused it, whether the bilge pump was operating, when the problem was recognized, and what steps were taken afterward. The public account has connected the boat problem with the sea tow call and the eventual decision to leave the island. That sequence needs to be pinned down with contemporaneous records rather than reconstructed from memory alone. A person remembering an emergency months later may remember the broad sequence correctly while misremembering a precise time. A dispatch log, GPS record, call recording, or contemporaneous message can provide a stronger anchor. The goal is not to manufacture a dramatic version of the afternoon. The goal is to determine which version is supported by the evidence. That is where the sea tow call becomes important. A trained dispatcher was dealing with a vessel that was reportedly experiencing trouble offshore, and the exchange included questions about the number of people aboard and the condition of those people. At one point, the dispatcher reportedly stopped the normal flow of the conversation and asked whether there was a living person on the boat. That wording has understandably attracted attention, but it needs to be interpreted carefully. A dispatcher's question is not proof that she believed a crime had occurred. Emergency personnel ask unusual questions when information is incomplete, when a caller's answers are unclear, or when they are trying to determine whether a rescue situation exists. The right question is not what viewers think the dispatcher must have suspected. The right question is why she asked what she asked, whether that question was part of standard procedure, and what the original recording actually establishes. The original call matters because short clips can create impressions that the complete conversation does not support. Tone, pauses, repeated questions, corrections, and surrounding context can all change how a statement should be understood. If the full recording exists, it should be preserved and interpreted in context. If dispatch protocols explain why the dispatcher asked about a living person, that explanation should be included. If the question was prompted by something specific the caller said, the record should make that clear as well. What should not happen is for an ordinary emergency question to be transformed into proof of a hidden confession. The recording can establish what was said. It cannot automatically establish what somebody privately intended. The Coast Guard question requires the same discipline. According to the public account, Coast Guard assistance was offered while the vessel was taking on water offshore, reportedly around 10 miles from shore, and the offer was declined. That decision is striking because Coast Guard involvement is associated with emergency response. Yet a refusal does not itself prove that the people aboard were concealing anything. People in distress can make poor decisions. They can underestimate a mechanical problem, believe a tow company is sufficient, misunderstand the seriousness of their situation, or simply want to avoid escalating an already stressful event. The important issue is what the people aboard believed was happening and what they communicated to the dispatcher at the time. If the Coast Guard offer is documented, the exact circumstances surrounding that offer should be established rather than replaced with assumptions. The departure from the island should therefore be reconstructed as a chain rather than treated as one isolated timestamp. First, investigators should establish when the group arrived. Next, they should identify what happened during the hours on the island. Then they should determine when the decision to leave was made. After that, the record should show when the boat problem became apparent. When Sea Tow was contacted, what assistance was discussed, whether Coast Guard assistance was offered, what response was given, and when the vessel finally departed. Those points can then be compared with the three-boat timeline. If everything aligns, that alignment would eliminate uncertainty. If something does not align, the discrepancy would tell investigators where to look next. Either outcome is more useful than a narrative built around assumptions. The phone creates a second chronology that may be just as important. Nolan's mother was reportedly contacted at approximately 11 o'clock that night and asked whether she had heard from her son. The significance of that question became greater because Nolan's phone was reportedly already back on the mainland. Again, that fact does not establish a crime. A phone can be separated from its owner for completely innocent reasons. Someone may leave a device behind, another person may transport it, or a family member may discover it before realizing the owner is missing. But once the phone's location became known, a straightforward question emerged. Who knew the phone was back on the mainland? When did they know? And what did they understand about Nolan's whereabouts at that moment? The 11 o'clock call deserves a precise reconstruction rather than a dramatic interpretation. Who placed the call to Nolan's mother? What exactly was asked? What information did the caller already have? What information did Nolan's mother have? Did the caller know that Nolan's phone was no longer with him? If so, how did that information affect the conversation? When was the phone recovered? Who possessed it before it was recovered? Was the device examined? And if so, what records were preserved? Call logs, messages, location information, photographs, and other digital evidence can potentially establish a sequence that human recollection cannot. The phone is therefore not important because it magically contains the answer. It is important because electronic records can help determine what people knew and when they knew it. That distinction is crucial in a case where the public has already seen competing narratives. One narrative may emphasize the timing of the phone call. Another may emphasize the fact that Nolan's phone had simply been left behind. Neither interpretation should be treated as proven until the underlying records are examined. A suspicious-looking sequence can have an innocent explanation, while an innocent-looking sequence can contain a contradiction that deserves investigation. The correct response to uncertainty is not to choose whichever story feels more compelling. It is to identify the records that can resolve the uncertainty and determine whether those records have been examined. The forensic questions introduce another layer of concern. Nolan's family reportedly sought an independent pathologist's assessment after the state examination, but the independent examination was limited because certain tissue, including material associated with the throat and lungs, had already been retained by the state. That limitation deserves attention, but it must be described accurately. Retention of forensic tissue can occur for legitimate medical or investigative reasons. The mere fact that tissue was retained does not establish that someone was trying to hide evidence. At the same time, if an independent pathologist is asked to evaluate a death and does not have access to material that could be relevant, the family has a legitimate reason to ask where that material is, why it was retained, and whether it can be independently examined. Those questions turn into chain of custody questions. What tissue was collected? Who retained it? Where has it been stored? What condition is it in? Was it examined by the state pathologist? Were portions consumed during testing? Did the independent pathologist formally request access? If access was not provided, what reason was given? Can the retained material still be examined today? These questions should be answerable through laboratory records, pathology records, evidence logs, and communications between the relevant parties. The important point is that a disagreement over forensic evidence should be resolved through documentation, not through speculation about motives. If the state's handling was routine, the records should demonstrate that. If there was an unusual limitation, the records should explain it. The state report is consequently central to the family's search for answers. A forensic report can contain findings that are difficult for a grieving family to interpret without professional assistance, including observations about injuries, drowning indicators, toxicology, tissue examinations, and limitations. If that report remains unavailable to the family because of an ongoing legal or investigative process, the public should not invent its contents. At the same time, the family has every reason to ask when the report will be released and what other evidence will be available for independent review. Transparency does not mean releasing every sensitive detail immediately. It means explaining what can be released, what cannot, why it cannot, and what process will eventually make the information available. The case has another institutional question that deserves a direct answer. Why is a county sheriff's department leading an investigation into a death that occurred on federally protected land? There may be a straightforward jurisdictional explanation. Federal and local authorities can have overlapping responsibilities, and agencies can cooperate under established legal arrangements. The involvement of a county sheriff does not itself imply that the investigation is improper. Still, the public should be able to understand who has primary jurisdiction, which federal agencies were notified, what role federal authorities have played, and why the county department is leading or participating in the investigation. Clear jurisdiction would remove another source of uncertainty without prejudging the outcome. The same principle applies to the grand jury. If a grand jury is eventually convened, its role should not be misunderstood. A grand jury is not a public trial, and a decision not to indict does not automatically answer every factual question surrounding a death. Conversely, an indictment would not establish guilt. It would mean that prosecutors had presented enough evidence to move the matter into another legal stage. For Nolan's family, however, the possibility of a grand jury creates a painful uncertainty of its own. What happens if the grand jury returns nothing? Does the investigation continue? Does the state report become available? Can the family receive additional evidence? Will the three-boat timeline be completed? Will the phone chronology be explained? Will the retained forensic material remain available for review? Those questions deserve answers before legal closure is mistaken for factual closure. This is also where the coverage of the case itself has to be examined. The public has already been exposed to a fraudulent toxicology report concerning Nolan that reportedly reached a very large audience. That episode demonstrates how quickly an invented document can become part of the public conversation. A screenshot can be copied thousands of times before anyone verifies it. Once viewers have seen a false claim, correcting it later is much harder than preventing it in the first place. For that reason, every serious discussion of Nolan's death should make a deliberate distinction between primary records, verified reporting, attributed statements, and material that cannot be sourced. Several claims raised in public interviews do not survive that standard. One example is the comparison involving Emmett Till and body flotation. Historical tragedies can be emotionally powerful reference points, but they are not interchangeable forensic experiments. Water temperature, salinity, depth, currents, body composition, clothing, injuries, decomposition, and countless other variables can influence what happens to a body in water. The fact that one body was recovered after a particular period does not establish when another body should have surfaced. Without forensic evidence specific to Nolan's circumstances, the comparison cannot establish a timeline and should not be presented as if it does. Another claim that requires caution is the characterization of an early statement by the sheriff. If an interview describes an official as saying something that the underlying statement does not actually say, then the characterization needs to be corrected. The safest standard is to quote or accurately paraphrase the original statement and distinguish it from a commentator's interpretation. That may seem like a minor editorial point, but in a case involving a grieving family and people who have not been charged with crimes, wording matters. A loose characterization can make an official appear to have reached a conclusion that the official never actually announced. Several other assertions made in the public discussion have also proved difficult to source. Those claims should remain labeled as unsupported unless a reliable document, recording, witness statement, or official record can substantiate them. Refusing to repeat an unsourced claim is not an attempt to protect an institution. It is an attempt to protect the integrity of the investigation. If a claim is true, it should eventually be possible to identify where it came from. If it cannot be traced, it should not be elevated into fact merely because it fits a compelling narrative. That standard becomes especially important because there are two different ways a case like this can go wrong. An institution can fail to provide enough information, leaving legitimate questions unanswered. At the same time, outside commentators can fill those gaps with claims that are exaggerated or false. The first problem creates uncertainty. The second creates misinformation. Neither should be accepted. The solution is not to automatically trust officials, and it is not to automatically distrust them. The solution is to compare statements against records and update the story when new evidence appears. For Nolan's family, that distinction must be more than an editorial principle. They have to live with the consequences of every rumor and every unanswered question. A fabricated report about their son can spread to millions of people, while the family may still be waiting for legitimate forensic information. A viral theory can take minutes to produce, while an official record may take months to obtain. That imbalance is painful because the loudest version of the story can become the version people remember even when it is wrong. Responsible coverage should therefore make the family's need for answers visible without turning their grief into evidence for a theory. The most useful way forward is to organize the unresolved issues into a documentary timeline. Start with the 3 boats at the mainland. Establish when each vessel departed, who was aboard, what tracking systems were operating, and whether the vessels remained together. Confirm their arrival at Horn Island. Record where each vessel was positioned. Establish the group's activities during the afternoon and identify the last independently documented time Nolan was seen. Then move to the departure decision. Identify the boat trouble, the bilge pump issue, the SETO call, the Coast Guard offer, and the actual departure time. After that, reconstruct the return trip, the phone's location, the late-night calls, and the moment Nolan's family learned that something was wrong. A timeline built this way would allow each claim to be tested against the next. The same reconstruction should include every available independent record. Phone logs can be compared with witness statements. GPS information can be compared with departure times. Dispatch records can be compared with accounts of the boat trouble. Photographs can be examined for timestamps and location information where appropriate. Messages can help establish when people communicated. Evidence logs can establish when forensic material changed hands. None of these records is automatically decisive. Their value comes from convergence. When independent records point toward the same sequence, confidence increases. When they conflict, investigators have identified a specific discrepancy that needs explanation. That is why the phrase, missing timeline, should not be understood as shorthand for hidden evidence. The absence of a publicly available record can have many explanations. Privacy, legal restrictions, incomplete equipment, data retention limits, investigative strategy, or simple administrative delay can all prevent information from appearing in public. But the existence of possible explanations is not a reason to stop asking. It is a reason to ask the question precisely: does the data exist? Who has it? and when can it be reviewed? The phone question should be treated the same way. The fact that Nolan's phone was reportedly on the mainland while his mother was being asked whether she had heard from him is unusual enough to warrant a timeline. But it is not enough to support a conclusion about intent. The important facts are possession, location, timing, and knowledge. Who had the device? Where was it? When was that location established? Who knew? When did investigators know? What did the family know? If those questions can be answered, much of the mystery surrounding the call may disappear. If they cannot, the reason for the gap becomes another question worth documenting. The boat problem also needs to be separated from assumptions about motive. A vessel taking on water can create confusion even among experienced people. A bilge pump can fail. A pump can operate intermittently. People can misjudge how quickly water is accumulating. A tow company can be called because the passengers believe the situation is manageable. Coast Guard assistance can be offered and declined because those aboard believe they can solve the problem themselves. None of that is proof of wrongdoing. Yet, because the boat trouble occurred during the same broader period in which the group left the island, the sequence deserves precise documentation. Timing can distinguish a routine mechanical problem from an event that changed the entire course of the afternoon. The sea tow dispatcher is another independent witness to the sequence, which is why the original call deserves preservation. She was not part of the group on the island. She was responding to information coming from the vessel. Her questions and the caller's answers therefore provide a contemporaneous snapshot. That does not make the call infallible. Dispatchers hear incomplete information, callers can be confused, and audio can be misunderstood. But contemporaneous emergency records are generally more useful for reconstructing a timeline than memories formed long afterward. The call should therefore be treated as evidence of what was communicated, not as a shortcut to a conclusion about what happened. The Coast Guard offer presents the same opportunity. If the record confirms that assistance was offered and declined, investigators should establish exactly what the caller understood about the offer. Was the refusal immediate? Was it qualified? Did the caller believe the boat was safe enough to continue? Was the situation improving? Was the boat already underway? What did the dispatcher document? These details could make a major difference in understanding the decision without assigning a motive that the evidence cannot prove. The forensic issue requires equal precision. Saying that the independent pathologist could not determine the cause of death because the state kept the tissue may overstate what the available record supports. A limitation in access to tissue is not necessarily the same thing as an inability to reach any conclusion, and retention itself is not evidence of misconduct. The safer formulation is that the independent examination was limited by the availability of certain retained material and that the family has questions about whether that evidence can be independently reviewed. That wording is less dramatic, but it is also more defensible. It leaves room for evidence to establish either an ordinary explanation or a more serious problem. The same caution should guide discussion of the investigation's jurisdiction. A county sheriff leading an investigation on federal land can sound contradictory to a viewer who assumes that federal land automatically means federal investigators must lead every case. That assumption may be wrong. Jurisdiction depends on the specific land status, applicable statutes, agreements, and agency responsibilities. Therefore, the responsible question is not why are local authorities investigating a federal crime, unless a federal crime has actually been established. The responsible question is what is the legal basis for the county sheriff's role, and what federal involvement exists. That question can be answered without prejudging the investigation. The grand jury issue is perhaps the hardest to communicate because viewers naturally want a definitive ending. A grand jury can feel like the moment when everything will finally become clear, but the legal system does not always operate that way. Evidence can be insufficient for an indictment even when many factual questions remain unresolved. Prosecutors can decide that a case does not meet the required legal standard. Witness credibility can be disputed. Evidence can be unavailable. A grand jury's decision is therefore not a complete historical account of Nolan's final hours. If the grand jury returns no indictment, the family may still need explanations about the evidence and the investigation. If an indictment occurs, the presumption of innocence remains in place and the evidence will still have to be tested through the legal process. That is why the public should resist the temptation to make the grand jury the sole destination of the story. The family's search for answers began before any grand jury process and will continue regardless of what that body does. The practical questions remain the same. What happened on the island? What happened on the boat? What happened to Nolan's phone? What happened during the emergency call? What forensic evidence exists? And what can be established about the final hours? Legal proceedings can address criminal responsibility. They do not automatically replace the need for a factual chronology. A responsible documentary also has to acknowledge what remains unknown. We do not know from the available material that any person on the island caused Nolan's death. We do not know that the three boats were hiding something. We do not know that the phone was deliberately separated from Nolan. We do not know that the boat trouble was anything other than a mechanical emergency. We do not know that the sea tow dispatcher suspected a crime. We do not know that Coast Guard assistance was declined for an improper reason. We do not know that the retained tissue was mishandled. We do not know that the county sheriff's jurisdiction is improper. Those statements are important precisely because a serious investigation should be willing to say unknown when the evidence does not support a stronger conclusion. What we can say is that the questions themselves are legitimate when they are tied to specific records. The three-boat timeline is a legitimate question because 3 vessels reportedly crossed to the island. The phone chronology is legitimate because the device was reportedly on the mainland while Nolan's mother was being contacted. The departure sequence is legitimate because the group left during the same broader period in which boat trouble was reported. The forensic question is legitimate because an independent pathologist's examination was limited by retained material. The dispatch question is legitimate because the original emergency call contains contemporaneous communication. The Coast Guard question is legitimate because assistance was reportedly offered and declined. The jurisdiction question is legitimate because multiple levels of government may have roles. The grand jury question is legitimate because its outcome may affect what happens next. Taken together, those questions do not form a verdict. They form an investigative checklist. That distinction is the heart of this story. A checklist does not tell you what the answer will be. It tells you what needs to be answered before you claim to know the answer. If the institutions involved can answer every item with records, the case becomes clearer. If several items remain unresolved, the public should know exactly which ones remain unresolved and why. Either outcome is preferable to a story in which speculation fills every empty space. The pressure on investigators should therefore be precise rather than sensational. Ask for the timeline. Ask for the evidence inventory. Ask for the forensic chain of custody. Ask for the dispatch records. Ask for the legal basis for jurisdiction. Ask what information can be released now and what information is restricted. Ask when restricted information can be reviewed. Ask whether the family has received the available reports. Ask what additional testing remains possible. These requests are difficult to dismiss as conspiracy rhetoric because they do not assume guilt. They ask institutions to demonstrate the work they say they have done. For viewers, the same discipline provides protection against misinformation. Before sharing a claim, identify its source. Before repeating an accusation, determine whether it is an allegation or a documented finding. Before treating a screenshot as evidence, ask where the original document came from. Before accepting a forensic comparison, ask whether a qualified expert has actually made it. Before believing a dramatic interpretation of an emergency call, listen to the full context if it is available. Before treating a legal outcome as a factual verdict, understand what that legal outcome actually means. These habits may not produce the most sensational video, but they produce a more trustworthy one. The family deserves that standard because grief creates vulnerability. When someone loses a child, uncertainty can be almost as painful as the loss itself. Every contradictory statement can reopen the question. Every new rumor can create another emotional shock. Every false document can force the family to explain that their child was not what the internet says he was. The least the public can do is refuse to add unsupported claims to that burden. Asking hard questions is appropriate. Inventing answers is not. Nolan's death also illustrates why institutional transparency matters even when investigators believe there is no crime. If the evidence ultimately demonstrates an accidental drowning or another non-criminal explanation, a thorough record should make that conclusion understandable. If the evidence remains insufficient to determine the exact circumstances, the investigation should say that clearly. If evidence eventually supports criminal charges, the case should move forward through the legal system. None of those outcomes requires the public to be told what it wants to hear. It requires the public to be shown what the evidence supports. The strongest version of this story therefore does not begin by naming a suspect. It begins with a gap. 3 boats crossed to Horn Island, but the public timeline is not equally detailed for all 3. That gap leads to another. Nolan's phone was reportedly back on the mainland while his mother was still being asked whether she had heard from him. That leads to another. The group arrived before noon and left before 5, but the precise sequence connecting the island stay, the boat trouble, and the departure still deserves reconstruction. From there comes the emergency call, the Coast Guard offer, the forensic limitations, the jurisdiction question, and finally the grand jury. Each step raises the next question naturally. The story escalates because the records connect, not because the narrator has to exaggerate. That structure is important for the audience because suspense should come from uncertainty rather than clutter. A good investigation does not need 10 shocking claims in the first minute. It needs one unanswered question that leads logically to another. Where are the other two boat timelines? Why was the phone already back on the mainland? What happened between noon and departure? Why did the dispatcher ask whether anyone was alive? Why was Coast Guard assistance declined? What happened to the retained tissue? Who has jurisdiction? What happens if the grand jury returns nothing? By the time the viewer reaches the final question, the story has accumulated weight without requiring a single unsupported accusation. The most important fact remains the same throughout. Nolan did not come home. Everything else should be measured against that reality. The purpose of examining the timeline is not to create a villain. It is to understand the final hours of a young man's life. The purpose of examining the phone is not to declare intent. It is to establish who knew what and when. The purpose of examining the boat trouble is not to imply that an emergency was staged. It is to determine how the group moved from the island to the mainland. The purpose of examining the forensic material is not to accuse the state of misconduct. It is to determine what evidence remains available for independent review. Even the strongest emotional moment in the story should return to evidence. Nolan's mother reportedly received a late-night question about whether she had heard from her son. That moment is heartbreaking, but its investigative value lies in the timeline surrounding it. What had happened before the call? What did the caller know? What did the mother know? Where was Nolan's phone? When did anyone realize Nolan was missing? Those questions convert emotion into chronology without exploiting the family's grief. The same principle applies to the boat departure. A group of people leaving an island before 5 o'clock can look ordinary until the surrounding circumstances are considered. A vessel experiencing trouble can also look ordinary until the emergency call is examined. A Coast Guard offer can sound routine until the decision to decline it is documented. Each individual event can have an innocent explanation. The investigative task is to determine whether the events fit together consistently. If they do, that consistency matters. If they do not, the discrepancies matter. The public should also remember that incomplete information can change. A document that is unavailable today may become available later. A witness may provide a clarification. An agency may release a report. A laboratory may complete testing. A court may resolve a confidentiality issue. A grand jury may change the legal posture of the case. Responsible coverage must therefore remain open to revision. A conclusion made today should not become a permanent belief that cannot be changed when new evidence appears. The goal is not to defend a narrative. The goal is to follow the evidence wherever it leads. That is particularly important after misinformation has already contaminated the case. The fraudulent toxicology report is a warning about how quickly certainty can be manufactured. Once people believe a document exists, they may begin interpreting every later event through it. A false toxicology claim can make a death look intentional, accidental, or suspicious before any legitimate forensic evidence has been reviewed. Correcting the record requires more than saying the document was fake. It requires teaching viewers to distinguish an authentic report from a fabricated one and to demand original sources whenever a supposedly explosive document appears. The same lesson applies to social media clips of the CETO call. A clipped recording can make a caller sound evasive, frightened, confused, or suspicious depending on where the edit begins and ends. Only the complete recording can establish the surrounding context. Even then, interpretation should be cautious. Tone is not a lie detector. Hesitation is not proof of guilt. An unusual answer is not a confession. The value of the recording is that it provides contemporaneous evidence of communication. It should be used to reconstruct the sequence, not to manufacture certainty about someone's state of mind. Likewise, a phone location is not automatically a map of human intention. A device can be left somewhere. Someone else can carry it. A location can update in ways that require technical interpretation. A timestamp can be misunderstood if the relevant system uses a different time zone or records an event differently from a caller's recollection. Digital evidence is powerful precisely because it can be precise, but precision does not eliminate the need for context. The phone's data should be examined by people who understand the technology and then compared with the human timeline. Forensic evidence deserves the same respect. A cause of death determination is not a single photograph or a single observation. It can involve multiple findings, laboratory testing, medical history, scene information, and expert interpretation. If an independent pathologist has limitations because specific tissue is unavailable, that limitation should be clearly described without turning it into a conclusion that the state examination was fraudulent. The correct response is to identify what can still be tested, what cannot, and whether the existing evidence is sufficient to support a conclusion. The jurisdiction issue may seem less emotionally important than the phone or autopsy, but it has practical consequences. When multiple agencies have potential responsibilities, the family needs to know who is accountable for the next step. If the county sheriff is the lead investigative agency, the department should be able to explain its role. If federal authorities have a separate responsibility, that role should be identified. If prosecutors are waiting for a state report or grand jury presentation, the process should be explained as far as legally possible. Clear responsibility reduces the chance that important questions fall between agencies. Eventually, every thread returns to the family. A parent should not have to become a forensic expert, maritime investigator, digital analyst, and legal researcher just to understand what happened to a child. Families often do become all of those things because they do not believe the answers are complete, but that should be a last resort rather than the normal path. The institutions involved have the resources and authority to reconstruct the evidence. Their obligation is to use those resources carefully and transparently. If the grand jury returns nothing, the family will still have to live with Nolan's absence. A legal non-event cannot reverse that reality. The most compassionate response would be to provide as much factual explanation as the law permits. If charges are not possible, say why. If evidence is inconclusive, explain the limitations. If the investigation remains open, explain what remains to be done. If the investigation is closed, explain the basis for closure. Silence may be legally convenient, but it does not necessarily provide the understanding a grieving family needs. That is why the final question is not simply whether somebody will be charged. The deeper question is whether the complete record will ever be assembled in a form that allows the family and the public to understand Nolan's final hours. A charge can answer one legal question. A timeline can answer many factual ones. A report can explain a forensic conclusion. A chain of custody record can explain where evidence went. A dispatch recording can establish what was communicated. A boat log can establish movement. Together, these pieces can create an evidence-based account even if the legal system ultimately cannot establish criminal responsibility. The case should therefore be followed through documents rather than predictions. Watch for the state report. Watch for verified information about the grand jury. Watch for clarification of the three-boat timeline. Watch for any documented explanation of the phone's movement. Watch for forensic updates. Watch for information about retained tissue. Watch for official clarification of jurisdiction. And when new information appears, compare it with what was previously reported. If the new record contradicts an earlier claim, the earlier claim should be corrected. That is how responsible coverage works. None of this requires viewers to choose between the family and the presumption of innocence. Those principles are compatible. Nolan's family can deserve answers while the people who were with him remain legally presumed innocent. Investigators can pursue every reasonable lead without announcing a crime occurred. Journalists can scrutinize official decisions without declaring officials corrupt. Viewers can remain skeptical without becoming certain. The strongest position is the one that leaves room for evidence to change the conclusion. Ultimately, the questions in this case are institutional questions. Where is the data from the other two boats? What happened to the phone? What did the 11 o'clock call mean in context? What happened during the hours on Horn Island? Why did the group leave when it did? What exactly happened with the boat trouble? What did the sea tow dispatcher hear? Why was Coast Guard assistance declined? What forensic material remains available? What did the independent pathologist conclude within the limits of the examination? Who has jurisdiction? What does the state report say? What will happen if the grand jury returns no indictment? Each question can be answered by records, procedures, evidence, or people with direct responsibility for the investigation. That is the standard Nolan's case deserves. Not a perfect story, because real investigations are rarely perfect. Not instant certainty, because evidence sometimes takes time. Not a viral accusation, because accusation is not proof. What is needed is a documented chronology that can survive scrutiny. If the evidence supports the existing account, publish it and explain it. If the evidence contradicts part of the existing account, correct it. If the evidence cannot answer a question, say that plainly. The public can handle uncertainty when uncertainty is explained honestly. The strongest ending, then, is not a declaration that the mystery has been solved. It is a demand that the record be completed. 3 boats went to Horn Island, and the public deserves a timeline for all 3. Nolan's phone returned to the mainland, and the circumstances surrounding that device deserve documentation. The group left the island before 5, and the connection between the departure and the boat trouble deserves a precise chronology. An independent forensic examination faced limitations, and the status of the retained evidence deserves clarification. A dispatcher received an emergency call, and the full context of that call matters. Coast Guard assistance was reportedly offered and declined, and the reason should be documented. A county sheriff's department is involved in a death on federally protected land, and the jurisdiction should be explained. A grand jury may eventually act, and its outcome should not be mistaken for a complete answer to every factual question. Nolan's story should not be reduced to whichever interpretation wins the internet. He was an 18-year-old who went out with friends and did not return home. His family has spent the aftermath trying to understand what happened. The public has heard competing accounts, dramatic theories, and demonstrably false material. The way out of that confusion is not another dramatic claim. It is a higher standard of evidence. Every document should be checked. Every allegation should be attributed. Every unsupported assertion should be removed. Every legitimate question should remain visible until it is answered or until investigators can explain why it cannot be answered. So the question at the center of this entire story remains deliberately simple. What happened to Nolan Wells during those final hours? The answer should not come from a commentator, a viral clip, a fabricated report, or an internet theory. It should come from the evidence. If the 3 boat timelines can be documented, document them. If the phone's history can be reconstructed, reconstruct it. If the emergency call can clarify the sequence, preserve and analyze it. If the forensic material can still be examined, examine it. If jurisdiction can be explained, explain it. If the grand jury reaches a decision, explain what that decision means and what it does not mean. Until then, the responsible position is neither blind trust nor certainty of guilt. It is scrutiny without accusation, skepticism without invention, and patience without forgetting the family at the center of the story. Nobody has been arrested. Nobody has been charged. No agency has publicly stated that a crime occurred. Those facts must remain part of the story. So must the unanswered questions. The 2 ideas do not cancel each other out. They are the reason a careful investigation is still necessary. If the record eventually answers every major question, then the story should change with it. If it does not, the gaps should be identified honestly rather than filled with speculation. Either way, the family deserves more than a collection of theories. They deserve an evidence-based account of what happened to their son, and the public deserves coverage that is strong enough to challenge official claims, disciplined enough to reject unsupported ones, and careful enough never to confuse a question with a conviction. That is where this story should leave us. Not with a suspect, not with a verdict, and not with a manufactured revelation, but with a standard. Follow the boats, follow the phone, follow the calls, follow the forensic evidence, follow the jurisdiction, follow the legal process, follow the documents wherever they lead. Then, and only then, decide what the evidence actually says. Until those answers are available, the most honest conclusion is also the most important one. There are questions that still deserve answers, and asking for those answers is not the same thing as accusing anyone of a crime. There is one final reason to keep the investigation focused on records rather than personalities. People can disagree about what a witness sounded like, whether a decision seemed reasonable, or whether a particular event feels suspicious. Those judgments are inherently vulnerable to emotion and hindsight. Records are not perfect either, but they give investigators something that memory and commentary cannot: a fixed point that can be checked against another fixed point. A timestamp can be compared with a call. A call can be compared with a location. A location can be compared with a witness statement. A witness statement can be compared with another witness. A laboratory record can be compared with the pathology report. A boat movement can be compared with the emergency dispatch. When several independent pieces of information converge, the story becomes more reliable. When they do not converge, the disagreement itself becomes evidence of where further work is needed. That is how uncertainty becomes manageable. It is not eliminated by confidence. It is reduced by verification. For that reason, future updates should resist the pressure to announce a breakthrough every time a new detail appears. A new document may clarify 1 minute without explaining the entire afternoon. A new witness may remember an important detail without resolving every contradiction. A forensic result may answer one question while creating another. That is normal. Investigations are built piece by piece. The audience should be told what changed, what did not change, and what remains unknown. This approach may feel slower than sensational coverage, but it protects the central objective, understanding Nolan's final hours accurately, enough that the family is not forced to choose between competing stories simply because the evidence was never assembled in one place. There is also a responsibility to correct the record when mistakes are discovered. If an earlier report repeated an unsupported claim, that claim should be withdrawn clearly rather than quietly buried. If a timeline changes because a primary record establishes a different time, the correction should be visible. If a dramatic theory is contradicted by forensic evidence, the theory should not remain alive merely because it generated attention. Corrections are not weaknesses. They are proof that the reporting process is responsive to evidence. In a case where misinformation has already traveled widely, that discipline is especially important. The goal is not to protect an earlier video, an earlier headline, or an earlier opinion. The goal is to protect the accuracy of the story itself. Ultimately, the family should not have to compete with the internet for the truth about Nolan. They should not have to watch strangers turn uncertainty into certainty while official records remain difficult to understand. They should not have to correct fabricated documents while waiting for legitimate answers. What they need is a process that treats every piece of evidence seriously, every person fairly, and every unanswered question with appropriate urgency. That process can still reach a conclusion without becoming accusatory. It can preserve innocence while pursuing facts. It can acknowledge uncertainty without surrendering the investigation. Most importantly, it can give Nolan's family something social media never can: an accountable, documented explanation of what the evidence shows, what it does not show, and why. Until that work is complete, the most responsible promise is simple: no unsupported certainty, no invented evidence, and no forgotten questions. Keep the focus on the record, keep the presumption of innocence intact, and keep Nolan's family at the center of the search for answers. That is the line this story should never cross. 8 words can make the final promise precise. Asterisk.